10 years after Hurricane Katrina made landfall and hammered New Orleans, we're looking back at that terrible time and also looking forward at what else needs to be done to improve the city. We'll also look back at when RFL visited New Orleans to see the devastation firsthand. What we saw was life-changing. And then remembering Sandy Hook by paying tribute to hero teacher Victoria Soto, who died protecting her students that horrible day. A student in Stratford named after Soto opened today. We spoke with her sister about Victoria's lasting legacy. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman, in tonight for Richard French, and we begin this evening in New Orleans, 1 decade after Katrina. What residents endured then and how they've come back now. The vibrant soul of the Crescent City shining on the eve of the anniversary marking one of New Orleans' darkest days. 10 years after Hurricane Katrina flooded 80% of this city and displaced more than 1 million people along the Gulf Coast.
We've come a long way.
There is a new $14.5 billion levee system. Homes are continually being rebuilt, and people are still returning to reclaim the city they love. But there are also wounds that haven't healed.
It's just horrible.
Including memories of the more than 1,000 lives lost and the slow emergency response.
We forget how all levels of government left us abandoned here. When I think back and I say, you know, how did they do that to us?
Today, met by a small group of protesters, former President George W. Bush returned here, reflecting on the recovery and focusing on the future.
The darkness from a decade ago has lifted. The Crescent City has risen again, and its best days lie ahead.
President Bush also traveled to Mississippi to honor the Katrina first responders there. Tomorrow, on the actual 10th anniversary, the commemorations continue with a visit from former President Bill Clinton. Earlier today, I spoke with former New York Times reporter Gary Rivlin, author of the book Katrina After the Flood. Gary, 10 years ago, you were working for the New York Times. You arrived in New Orleans a couple of days after Katrina made landfall. As you look back a decade later, what comes to your mind when you think of what you first saw on the ground?
You know, in some ways, this place is a miracle. You know, the place was 80% covered with water when I arrived. There was a real sense in those early months. The question was, would New Orleans survive? In Washington, some very powerful forces were saying most of that place should be bulldozed. And the city is back. The problem is, while in the center of town, along the Mississippi River, things are going great, it's out in the neighborhoods, in the eastern half of the city, parts of the western half of the city. They're still struggling. I talked to a guy the other day, and he said, they got rid of the water, but I'm still drowning. You've got communities that are really only half back 10 years after Katrina.
And just sticking with the immediate aftermath of the storm, 10 years later, most people know the images, the people on rooftops, the Superdome, the levees, heck of a job, Brownie. But you saw a lot more than most other people did. What, to your mind, was the most underreported or least known storyline in New Orleans in those first few days?
You know, the recovery, the rescue operation, there was amazing heroics. You just had people out on boats, rescuing people on their own. I mean, some of it was state sanctioned, federal government sanctioned, but much of it's just people on their own, just going out there, and black, white, rich, poor, nothing made a difference. So that's part of the story. But to me, one of the great shames, a shameful incident, was the blockade of a bridge out of New Orleans. If you were in the center of town, the way out of New Orleans was across the Crescent City connection, the Mississippi River Bridge, or you just call it the Gretna Bridge, people locally call it. And so you had largely black crowds trying to get to the other side, to the largely white suburbs, and there was a fear. And so the police, local police and sheriffs, on their own, without permission, it's a state-run bridge, just blockaded it, would not let any pedestrians through, stood there with guns and shot them in the air to scare people off, and wouldn't let them through. So we have this sense, and in a crisis, we all come together, and there was a lot of beautiful working together, but there was also this incident which just caused a lot of extra anguish for thousands, tens of thousands of people.
Gary, reading your book, Katrina After the Flood, it seems as though you knew in the first couple of days that the recovery process was going to be slow and uneven, to say the least. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, lots of people were looking at what happened, who's to blame, why the levees fail, all essential questions. But to me, it's like, this was just this moment. This was the worst urban disaster in U.S. history. 80% of the city covered with water, 110,000 homes destroyed, schools, businesses, utilities all wiped out. How are they going to rebuild? It just seemed this monumental task. Everything depended on everything else. Can I rebuild? Should I rebuild? Would anyone help me rebuild? Will it be schools for my kid? Will I have next door neighbors? Will there be businesses in my community? Will it have a sense of community? So to me, it was just this big, huge problem that it just fascinated me as a journalist.
It seems as though there have been really two different recoveries in New Orleans, one for the white community and another less effective one for black residents. I know that's been a focus of much of your reporting. Tell us more about that difference.
Right. So, right away, first week after the storm, you had powerful forces in the white community, white business leaders openly saying, this is our chance to re-seize control of New Orleans, to change it, as one high-profile uptown resident said, to change it demographically. This was a 68% black city before Katrina, and change it politically. This was a black-run city. And so on one front, you had people openly plotting to see if this is their chance to re-seize control. And then you had policies. So some public housing units were flooded, many were not. But all of them were shut down. All of them were surrounded by fence and razor wire, and they were never reopened. I mean, it was sort of delaying people coming home, which meant they were developing routes elsewhere. Road Home, largest housing recovery program in U.S. history, over $10 billion. 5 years after Katrina, a judge found that it was racially discriminatory. It favored white communities, he found, over black communities. Well, by that point, it was too late. All but $150 million had been spent. The last category is inaction. Half the city were renters. There was never any plan to help the renters. It was all around the homeowners. And I think of the quote from Barney Frank, the ex-congressman, it was ethnic cleansing through inaction.
Has race been the only division in the recovery process? Is there a financial division as well, with the better off being able to recover better and the worse off not?
Right, exactly. I mean, race is a big factor, but, class and there are other factors. So I focus on three different communities. You have Lakeview, well-off white community that was completely covered in water. 10 years after Katrina, it's 100% back, arguably better than ever. Then you go to New Orleans East, a black prosperous community, middle class, professional class. It's about 80% back after Katrina. Then you go to the lower Ninth Ward, low income black. It's 36% of the population is back 10 years after Katrina. It's still a disaster zone. It looks like Katrina happened a year ago. And in between, you've got black working class, black middle class, and they're about half back 10 years after Katrina. So you see that New Orleans East is doing better than the lower Ninth Ward. It's a more prosperous community, but it's still not doing nearly as well as Lakeview.
Gary, can these disparities, can these mistakes be fixed, or is it too late? Is everything set in stone at this point?
I don't know if it's too late, but it's very late. There's a little bit of FEMA money still coming in, but that's to fix roads and buildings, public buildings. There's some money, some Katrina money. There was a settlement after that lawsuit around Road Home, so there's a few $100 million, but it's really late. And another problem, too, is that it's really profound at the 10th anniversary. The city leaders are taking something of a victory lap. The mayor back in May said the recovery's over. Now we're moving on, and yet in the eastern half of the city, there's still a lot of suffering. So I think it's pretty grim right now.
And finally, is that your sense of what New Orleans' future is probably going to be like? Pretty grim, or do you see green sprouts and the opportunity for a more positive outcome?
Well, the good news is that in the center of town, the economy is doing very well. There's something of a startup scene. There's a lot of energy. So there is a chance that, the rising tide will bring up all boats. But, as of now, I look at, the drowned out parts of New Orleans, the African-American parts of the city, as no different than a Detroit with blight or West Baltimore, that it's just now another urban community with a lot of blight that seems largely on its own.
Gary Rivlin, author of Katrina After the Flood. It is a must-read on this subject as we approach the 10th anniversary. Gary, thanks for a few minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Up next, RFL's eye-opening visit to New Orleans after Katrina. We spoke with survivors who stuck it out and also those who left and never came back.